I had spent too many years moving from one place to another. Forests in the north where the snow stayed late into spring. Wide eastern plains where the wind never seemed to rest. Red stone valleys that baked under a merciless sun. I had managed horses and cattle for lords who barely remembered my face, slept in stables more often than beds, and left before anyone could ask me to stay. At 35, I was tired of the road. When the offer came to manage the Greyhorn estate, its horses, its oxen, its hayfields and wagons, I took it, not because the land was the best I had seen, but because I wanted somewhere wide enough to work and quiet enough to call home. Ravenford was not quiet, but it was steady. A border town where traders, farmers, and drovers passed through on their way to larger markets. People here knew each other's business and made sure everyone else did too. I had been in town less than a week when I first heard the name. Brayla Ironroot, the woman who ran the feed store after her father's hands gave out, tall, strong, loud when she laughed, which was rare. She lifted sacks that made grown men grunt, kept the books without help, and collected debts without apology. The men in the taverns and along the loading docks had plenty to say about her. Too tall for a woman. Laughs like she owns the place. Speaks her mind when she should keep it shut. Hard to marry off, that one. Too difficult. I listened the way I listened to weather reports, useful information, nothing more. Then I went to the Ironroot store on my first morning as Greyhorn's new manager. I needed to open an account for hay, oats, and straw. The place smelled of grain and leather and clean sawdust. A bell above the door gave a single clear note when I stepped inside. She was at the back, lifting a heavy sack of oats onto a high shelf, green skin darkened by work and sun, black hair tied back with a strip of leather, arms bare and corded with muscle. She set the sack down, dusted her hands on her apron, and turned. Her eyes met mine without hesitation. "What do you need?" Her voice was low and direct. No smile offered, none expected. I told her I was taking over the Greyhorn account. Previous payments had been on time, I said. I wanted the same terms. She pulled a thick ledger from under the counter, opened it to a page already marked, and began writing without asking unnecessary questions. Quantity, schedule, number of horses, number of draft oxen. She wrote quickly, the quill moving in clean lines. When she finished, she read the figures back once. I corrected nothing. "Old Greyhorn account was reliable," she said. "I will keep the same credit terms for you." I nodded. I appreciate working with someone who keeps things clear. She paused, the quill hovering above the page for half a breath. It was small, that hesitation, but I noticed it. People had probably said many things to her over the years, compliments about her strength or her usefulness in harvest season. Rarely, I guessed, about the simple fact that she did her work well and expected the same in return. I paid for a small order of oats to start, signed the page she turned toward me, and left. Outside, 2 men leaned against the hitching rail, talking low. "He hasn't seen how difficult she is yet." "Give him a month. She'll run him off same as the others." I kept walking. Their words followed me down the street like dust. I thought about the woman inside the store, the way she had looked straight at me, and the way she had handled the ledger like it was an extension of her own hands, the way she had not once lowered her eyes or softened her voice to make herself smaller. Difficult, they called her. I wondered if the word meant anything at all, or if it was simply what men said when a woman refused to shrink. That evening, I sat on the low stone wall behind the Greyhorn stables and watched the last light fade from the fields. The air smelled of cut hay and horse sweat and wood smoke from the cookhouse. I had wanted a place to stop. I had not expected to find, on my very first day in town, someone who already seemed to understand the value of standing still and doing the work in front of her without apology. I did not know her story yet. I only knew that the town had decided it for her, and that their version felt smaller than the woman I had seen lifting sacks and keeping books with steady hands. Perhaps the problem was not that she was difficult. Perhaps the problem was that most of them had never been large enough to meet her where she stood. I would go back. Not because I needed anything urgent, because something in the way she had paused when I spoke of clarity told me no one had said that to her in a long time, and because I was tired of moving on before I understood what I was leaving behind. 3 days later, I found myself walking back to the Ironroot store with a single, small sack of hay under one arm. The estate already had more than enough. I knew it. The men who worked the stables knew it. The only person who did not seem surprised was the woman behind the counter when I pushed open the door. She looked at the sack, then at me. "A place the size of Greyhorn needs exactly 1 bag of hay?" I set it on the counter. "I am still learning the town. Thought I might ask a few questions while I was here." She rested both hands on the worn wood and studied me for a moment. Then she nodded once, as if deciding the excuse was thin but acceptable. "Ask." I asked about the best place for a meal that did not come with a side of gossip. She told me Marga's kitchen on the East Road, where the stew was honest and the portions were not measured by how much coin you flashed. I asked about the smith who would not overcharge a new man for a simple shoeing. She pointed me toward the brothers on the East Road and warned me to avoid the pair near the old well unless I enjoyed paying twice for work done half as well. When I asked about the town council, she gave a short laugh that held no warmth. They liked the sound of their own voices more than the sound of problems being solved. I leaned on the counter. "Anyone else I should keep my distance from?" She did not hesitate. "Anyone who tells you Ravenford is simple. No place worth staying in is ever that simple." The answer sat between us for a breath. I looked at her directly. "And you? Should I keep my distance from you?" She went still. Not the stillness of someone caught off guard, but the stillness of someone measuring how much truth to give. After a moment she spoke, voice lower than before. "Most people in Ravenford would tell you yes." I nodded. "I have only been here a few days, but I have already noticed that most people in Ravenford talk more than they listen." Something changed in her face then, not a full smile. Just the smallest lift at one corner of her mouth, there and gone before most would have seen it. She turned away to write the receipt for the hay I did not need, but the movement was slower than it had been the first time I left with the sack and the knowledge that I would be back. Over the next weeks I returned more often than the ledgers required, once for twine, once to ask the current price of oats, once simply to stand on the porch as she was locking the shutters for the night and speak of nothing more important than the coming frost and the condition of the Greyhorn horses. Each time she answered without hurry. Each time she did not ask why I had come. The town noticed. I heard it in the way conversations dropped when I passed the loading dock. I saw it in the glances exchanged between men who had nothing better to do than watch a new manager spend too much time at the feed store. One evening, as I checked the feet of a gray mare in the stable yard, Bren Talwick, the older of the 2 stable hands, spoke without looking up from the harness he was oiling. "You know who you have been keeping company with, don't you?" I kept my hand on the mare's fetlock. "I do." Brayla Ironroot, tall as most men, keeps books better than any clerk I ever met and will not soften her tongue for anyone. "You heard what they call her?" "I have heard." Bren waited. When I said nothing more, he shook his head. "You are a strange one, manager." "Probably." He laughed once, short and surprised, then went back to his work. I finished checking the mare and straightened. The word difficult had followed me out of the store that first day and had not left since. Every time I heard it, it sat wrong in my chest. Not because I thought Brayla was easy, because I had already seen that the men who used the word most freely were the same ones who had never once tried to meet her on equal ground. By the end of the month, she no longer asked why I had come when I appeared at the counter. She simply set the ledger aside, poured 2 cups of tea from the pot she kept warm on the small iron stove behind the counter, and placed one in front of me after the last customer had gone. We sat on the low stool she kept for when her father came to sit with her. The tea was strong and bitter, and exactly what the evening required. She spoke of the store, of the years after her father's hands began to fail, of learning the ledgers by candlelight because there was no one else to do it. I spoke of the places I had left behind and the reason I had stopped moving. Neither of us filled the silences with easy words. The silences were comfortable. They belonged to 2 people who had both learned in different ways that not every quiet needed to be filled. Outside, the street grew dark. Inside, the small stove threw a steady warmth across the worn floorboards. I did not know what name the town would eventually give to whatever was growing between us. I only knew that each time I left the store later than I had intended, the road back to Greyhorn felt shorter than it had the day before. The frost had already touched the fields when I rode into town one evening and found her locking the shutters of the store. The sky was the color of old iron, and the air carried the sharp edge that warned winter was no longer a rumor. She turned at the sound of the horse's hooves and looked at me without surprise. "You need something today?" I dismounted and tied the reins to the rail. For a moment I considered lying, inventing some small reason that would let me keep the distance we had built so carefully. Then I decided I was finished with excuses. "Nothing," I said. "I came because I wanted to walk with you if you are willing." She studied me for a long time. The key was still in her hand. Behind her, the store stood dark and quiet. I could hear the faint creak of the sign above the door moving in the wind. She slipped the key into her pocket, untied her apron, and hung it on the hook beside the door. "Give me a minute." We walked along the river path that followed the Raven north of town. The trees had already dropped most of their leaves. Their bare branches made black lines against the gray sky, and the water moved slow and dark between the banks. Our breath showed white when we spoke. She wore a heavy green cloak that made her look even taller than she was. I walked beside her without trying to match her stride. She did not slow down for me. For a while, neither of us said anything. The only sounds were our boots on the damp earth and the occasional call of a bird settling for the night. Then she spoke, voice low and even. "When I was 19, my father's hands started to fail. He could no longer lift the sacks or write the figures clearly. I taught myself the ledgers from an old book because there was no one else to do it. I learned at night after the work was finished. Some customers tried to take advantage because they thought a girl could be cheated. I learned to be harder than they expected. If I had not, the store would have been lost. I listened without interrupting. She was not asking for pity. She was simply telling me what had shaped her. I told her about the years I had spent moving between estates, about sleeping in stables and eating beside cook fires and leaving before anyone could ask questions I did not want to answer. When the offer came from Greyhorn, I accepted because I was tired of never belonging anywhere long enough to miss it. She glanced at me. "Was it only the land that made you stay?" "At first," I said. "Now I think there may be something else in this town that makes the idea of leaving less appealing." We walked a little farther. The path grew narrower where the river curved. She stopped and looked out over the water. "You have heard what they say about me." It was not a question. I nodded. "They say you are too much. Too tall, too direct, too good at your work, too difficult for any man to manage." She kept her eyes on the dark river. "And what do you think?" I chose my words carefully because I knew she would hear the difference between flattery and truth. "I think they are using the wrong measure. They are judging you by the size of men who have never had to stand beside someone who does not need their permission to exist. That is not your failing. It is theirs." She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the bare branches above us and sent a few last dry leaves spinning down onto the path. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before. "Corvin, what are you actually doing?" It was the first time she had used my name. I turned to face her. "I am saying that Ravenford has been wrong about you for a long time, and I would like the chance to be right about you if you will let me." She looked at me as though she were seeing something she had not expected to find. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition, the kind that comes when someone finally stops trying to make you smaller so they can feel larger. She drew a slow breath and let it out. "All right." The word was simple. It carried no promises beyond itself, but it was enough. Enough to tell me the door I had been standing outside had opened. After that evening, the shape of our days changed without either of us announcing it. I no longer needed reasons to go to the store. She no longer asked what I needed when I appeared. Sometimes we walked after she closed. Sometimes we simply sat with tea and let the silence between us do the talking. The town continued to murmur. I heard pieces of it when I passed the docks or the tavern. The words had shifted slightly. They no longer only called her difficult. Now they wondered what a man like me thought he was doing. I did not answer them. I had already given my answer to the only person whose opinion mattered. She waited for me now, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And I came because I had stopped looking for reasons to leave. The first real snow had not yet fallen, but the mornings had turned sharp and white along the edges of the fields. I rode into town one of those cold mornings and found her stacking empty grain sacks behind the store. She straightened when she saw me, wiping her hands on her apron. "Would you like to see the northern pastures at Greyhorn?" I asked. "The frost has turned everything silver. It is worth the ride." She did not answer at once. Her eyes moved past me toward the road that led out of town, then back. I saw the hesitation and understood it. 3 years earlier, she had gone to the town stables to hire a horse. The one they brought her was too small, the saddle too narrow. When she tried to mount, someone had laughed and said a woman her size would break any decent horse. She had walked away and had not ridden since. I did not mention any of that. I only waited. She gave a small nod. "Perhaps another day." The next morning I returned leading a tall gray mare. Silver Frost. She stood 16 hands, deep-chested and steady-tempered, the kind of horse that did not startle at sudden movement or heavy weight. I had spent an hour before dawn checking every strap and buckle myself. The saddle had been widened and padded, the stirrups adjusted to her height. Nothing had been left to chance or to the opinion of men who measured worth by how small they could make someone feel. She stepped out of the store and stopped when she saw the mare. Her gaze moved from the horse to the saddle to me. "You know what happened at the stables." "I know," I said, "and I hate that they made you ashamed of something that was never your fault." She stood very still between the doorway and the horse. I could see the pull inside her, the old desire to sit above the ground again, and the newer fear of being made small in front of someone whose opinion had begun to matter. I looked straight at her. "Silver Frost is not too small. The saddle has already been set for you. This horse is steady enough." She did not move. I kept my voice quiet but clear. "Sit down here and let me show you." It was not an order. It was not a challenge. It was a promise that this time no one would turn her into a joke. She drew a slow breath, placed her foot in the stirrup, and swung up. The mare stood solid beneath her, ears relaxed, breathing steady. For 3 years, Brayla had not sat on a horse. Now she sat tall, shoulders square, the reins resting lightly in her hands. The world looked different from that height. I saw it in the way her eyes widened slightly, taking in the road and the fields beyond as though she were seeing them for the first time in a long while. I mounted my own horse and rode beside her out of town. We followed the track that led north toward the Greyhorn pastures. The grass was stiff with frost. Every blade caught the low winter sun and turned the entire field into a sheet of pale silver that moved and glittered when the wind passed over it. Our horse's breath rose in white plumes. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the soft crunch of hooves on frozen ground. She rode without speaking for a long time. I did not try to fill the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was rougher than usual. "I had forgotten what this feels like." "You did not forget," I said. "Other people only made you believe you were not allowed to have it anymore." We rode farther, letting the horses choose their own pace across the open ground. At the highest point of the pasture, we stopped. Below us, the field stretched out in every direction, white and quiet under the winter sky. She turned in the saddle to look at me. "Are you doing all of this to win me over?" I met her eyes. "No, I do not try to win most people. Only you." She studied me for a moment, then looked back across the shining fields. "It is better than I expected." I turned my horse so we faced each other. The wind moved between us, cold and clean. I had spent years leaving places before anyone could ask me to stay. I had told myself I was simply restless. Standing there on the frost-covered rise, I understood it had been something else. I had been waiting to find someone large enough that stopping beside them felt like coming home instead of giving up. "Brayla," I said, "I have found someone big enough that I want to stop moving. You are the first person who has made me feel I have already found what I was looking for." She looked at me for a long time. The frost on her cloak caught the light. Her hands rested on the reins, steady. When she spoke, it was barely above the sound of the wind. "Corvin," I waited. "Ask me." I understood then that she had already given me the answer before I formed the question. The fields around us stayed silent under their silver coating. The horses stood patient in the cold. And for the first time since I had arrived in Ravenford, I felt no urge to keep moving. On the frozen rise, with the silver fields spread out below us, I swung down from my horse and walked to where she sat on Silver Frost. The wind had picked up, carrying the clean scent of frost and distant pine. I looked up at her. This woman who had never once asked the world to make itself smaller so she could fit inside it. "Brayla Ironroot," I said, "will you marry me?" She did not pretend surprise. She did not look away or make me wait while she weighed the answer for show. She simply smiled, small and certain, the same way she had smiled the first time I told her I liked working with someone who kept things clear. "Yes." The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of every choice she had ever made to remain exactly who she was. We married in February in the small stone church at the edge of Ravenford. Neither of us wanted a large affair. The guest list was short. Her father, Hogar, who sat in the front row with red eyes and a hand that trembled when he reached for hers, the few hands from Greyhorn who had become something like friends, and a handful of people who had never needed to call her difficult because they had never tried to make her smaller. Half the town came anyway, some out of curiosity, others because they could not quite believe the rumors had been wrong for so long. When she walked down the short aisle in a simple dress the color of winter moss, I saw the faces of the men who had once said she was too much. They watched her now without laughter. I stood waiting and thought that she had never been too much. They had only ever been too little. After the short ceremony, we returned to our separate work. She kept the Ironroot name above the feed store because it was the name her father had hung there for 30 years. She continued to lift sacks, keep the ledgers, and collect what was owed without apology. I continued to manage Greyhorn's horses and fields. In the evenings, she often came to the estate office and went through my accounts with a speed and accuracy no clerk I had ever hired could match. She never asked permission to help. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. Every Saturday morning, weather permitting, she rode Silver Frost out across the northern pastures. At first, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Then they grew used to the sight. Eventually, it became something ordinary. The tall orc woman on the tall gray mare moving across the frost or the new grass back straight, eyes on the horizon. No one laughed anymore. The laughter had always belonged to people who feared what they could not control. The talk in Ravenford changed the way talk always changes when it has been proven wrong for too long. They stopped saying she was difficult to manage. They began to say she was capable. They stopped wondering why no one had married her. They began to say she had found the right man. I never corrected them. The truth was simpler and larger than any of their revised opinions. I had not come to Ravenford to tame anything. I had come because I was tired of moving. What I found was a woman who had never needed taming. She had only needed one person willing to stand beside her without asking her to shrink. On the day I asked her to marry me, I already knew she was the answer I had been traveling toward without realizing it. And on the day she said yes, I finally stopped looking for the next place to go. The fields at Greyhorn still needed tending. The store still needed its sacks lifted and its books balanced. The town still talked, because towns always do. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that every evening I returned to a life that no longer felt like something I was merely passing through. She was there, and for the first time in many years, so was I.